Welcome everybody to this Ruby Hangout. Now we're on March 13th with Noah Gibbs. Noah's going to be talking to us about why it's actually a good idea to build a web server using Pure Rack. The things that you can read about more in his book, Rebuilding Rails, which I'm sure he'll get into. Noah is the lead Rubyist for OnLive.com and author of, as I mentioned, Rebuilding Rails at rebuilding-rails.com. We're going to get a lot more from him in just a few minutes. Just quick introductions. So this is the Ruby Hangout. I realized I actually haven't introduced us for a while, probably since the first one. So what is the Ruby Hangout? We are a Ruby meetup that happens on the internet. So all you people who are currently watching this at your home or at your office or wherever you are, this is probably the most convenient meetup you will ever attend. It's really great because we get to bring in great speakers and presenters like Noah from all over the country. In fact, I actually have no idea where Noah is, so we're going to ask him where he is when we get started. But like, I'm right outside Washington, D.C., and I know Jordan's in Kentucky, for example. The rest of us are right outside D.C. because, hey, you can go with your friends, right? So, but, you know, we can bring this meetup to you in your home, wherever you are, whenever you are, because again, this is recorded, so I'm sure plenty of you will be watching us recorded later. And welcome, thanks for watching, and you know, you can get all this great content for free over the internet thanks to YouTube and Google. So again, Google Meetup, or sorry, Ruby Meetup. One of the big benefits of a meetup is that we get this great community. So how do we get that community when we only fit 10 people into a Hangout? Well, that's what all the rest of these people are here for. These are your moderators. They are here to help you connect with everybody here and everybody else out there. So we ask you to post your questions or comments via either the YouTube comment page or with Twitter with hashtag RubyHangout, or in IRC on irc.freenode.net with #RubyHangout as the channel. Any of those, please leave a comment. Also, we check the Google event, the Google Plus event, for comments there too. So please leave us your comments, your questions. We'll bring those to Noah live in the stream, and if you leave them afterwards, we will try and answer them later on the recordings. So that's the social stuff. Also, after the actual Hangout, what we're going to do is go and do some live Google Hangouts that aren't limited. Well, they're still limited to 10 people, but they're not on air. So what that means is you can just join us and chat, and hopefully Noah will have time to sit down with us. We'll see, but the rest of us will definitely be hanging out, having a beer, talking, and we'll get into more details about that after Noah's done. But enough from me. I'm Josh Schmeida. I'm one of the co-organizers here. JP is my other co-organizer. So thanks very much, JP, and thanks again to the moderators. We've got tonight Chris Sexton, Jordan Bedwell. I'm sorry, I didn't actually ask how to pronounce your last name. Nathan Harvey, and Sean Marcia. So thanks again, moderators. Really appreciate your help. Definitely please send us questions or comments. IRC, YouTube, Twitter, Google+, anything, we'll figure it out. So without further ado, welcome, Noah. Thank you again very much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
No problem. Good to be here.
So where are you actually?
I'm in Mountain View, California right this second. So San Francisco Bay Area.
Fantastic. You're in like the heart of tech, aren't you?
I really am. Yeah, we're not far from Google.
Yeah. So lead Rubyist for OnLive.com. I've actually heard of OnLive, but I'm sure plenty of other people have not. So what is OnLive, and what does it mean to be the lead Rubyist?
OnLive is an application rental service, mainly games. Basically, we run a game on our server. We get the control information from whatever device you're using to play it. We pre-render the video and we send it back. So if you wanted to play the latest Xbox first-person shooter on your iPad, you would hook up to OnLive to do that.
Nice.
If that makes sense. The nice thing about it all being pre-rendered video is that it doesn't matter so much what device you're playing on, and doesn't matter, you know, what the game's designed for. We run it on our servers, we send you the video. We have an Xbox here, you have an iPad there, that's no problem. It all displays video.
That's really awesome. How does the latency for the control input?
Surprisingly good. That's really the trick here, is that if you do it in the obvious way, the latency is terrible. So, you know, that's the exact question. We have a ridiculously low latency proprietary hardware codec for compressing the video and sending it out. So, to the extent we've got secret sauce that nobody else has, that's the secret sauce.
That's very cool. So you actually modify the hardware to like get an input.
We have a separate little hardware encoder, and so when I say something runs on an Xbox in our cluster, it's running on the device there, and then also a codec that we hook up to it.
Cool.
Yeah.
One second, I'm hearing there's an issue with the stream link. It seems like our moderator's getting that out there. Nathan, you still have access to Twitter, right? You're gonna get that out, right? Okay, cool. All right, sorry. Go ahead, Nathan or Noah. So that's actually really cool. I've actually kind of seen OnLive, I think, once at like maybe a PAX once or something, but I never actually really looked at it myself. So
yeah, well, it's all live. So if you want to show up and get your free half hour of whatever games are on the service, just go to our website. The nice thing about it is that, well, of course, the video encoding is hardware, and a lot of the playback pipeline, you wouldn't touch Ruby with a 10-foot pole for that. All that has to be C++ or Java or the very lowest level you can get. Mm-hmm. You can do pretty much any app you want that way. I mean, if it handles Halo, then it handles Microsoft Word without a hitch, right? And it does. You can actually, if you want to run Microsoft Word on your iPad, you can literally just do that through us. And there's nothing game specific. It's just that if you can handle game latency requirements, everything else is easy. But you need an infrastructure to set all that up, to set up the servers on our back end, to pre-allocate that stuff, to figure out what the network channel is, to monitor the latency. And a lot of that stuff we are in the process of setting up in Ruby, because Ruby's sort of Perl-like. It's a really good architecture for that. Anyway, yeah, building the team. Like everywhere in Silicon Valley, we're hiring vigorously. So if you're looking for a place to do Ruby, this is a good spot where we're doing a lot of good greenfield work. But the other fun part is I've got a whole building full of Java and C++ programmers, and my whole mission here is to convert them.
Nice.
Yeah. I mean, that's a sweet gig.
Yeah, that is pretty sweet. That's pretty awesome. So I'm sure Nathan's obvious question is, are you using Chef?
No, we're using Puppet.
Oh, burn.
Yeah.
Sorry, Nathan.
Yeah. We use Chef and Java. If it helps, they're both written in Ruby. Well, it helps me. It doesn't help him so much. Chef's a good tool. We liked it a lot at Uyala, but they have an existing excellent Puppet infrastructure here, and I have 10 different religious wars to fight here, so I'm not going to add the Chef Puppet thing.
Yeah, totally understand. We actually use Puppet at my place, but we're looking at switching to Chef. So
yeah, they're both great tools. They're both wonderful tools.
Absolutely, both very, very powerful. And so then rebuilding Rails, what was the impetus? Why did you write the book, and what is the book about?
Sure. So I basically sat down and wrote the book about Rails that I wish somebody had written before I got there. Rebuilding Rails starts from the libraries Rails uses under the hood at the very lowest level. It's built from Rack. It's built from, not even Active Record. You build your own little ORM, but from like the SQLite gem and from Rack. And you build a framework structured like Rails on the same libraries Rails uses. So obviously it's not as big, it's not as high line count, but you've built essentially a little Rails, a miniature Rails. And so all of the weird things that Rails does, where you sort of go, why the hell does it do that? You know why, because you know what the trade-offs were. And maybe there were a couple of choices, but you can see that Rails makes really pretty fundamentally reasonable choices, even where it's weird. It's because there's not usually a way to do it that isn't weird.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense. So you're going to essentially be walking us through some of that tonight, aren't you?
Well, so what I'm doing here is a little simpler than that. I mean, it's a 9-chapter, more than 100-page book, so obviously I'm not going to hit the whole thing in one slideshow.
Yeah.
But instead what we're going to do is we're going to build a smaller, slightly Sinatra-like framework, but much more low-level, just build an interesting thing in Rack without trying to structure it like Rails. So we'll build a nice, simple Rack framework. You can see how you'd build to Rails from there. Even more easily, you can see how to build to Sinatra from there. And if we have extra time, I've actually got a talk I gave as a lightning talk for building Sinatra on Rack in 14 lines. Yeah, there's a guy online who claims he's gotten it down to 6. I believe it, but I haven't got it that small.
Wow, that's very cool.
Yeah, no, Ruby 1.9 has some good stuff, so maybe we'll look at that too.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, as part of the same thing. All right, so I'm going to turn on the screen share. I'm going to pop up the slides.
Yeah, let's get started.
And you should be seeing them now.
Yep.
Excellent. So, just build your server on rack. By the way, I'm only half joking when I say, go down to the lowest level because I don't trust anybody above that. Fundamentally, I want to understand it at least that far down because your fancy framework that you built with many layers on top of that is going to break, and I'm going to have to go in and debug it. So at the very least, I'd better know what you're building on. It's an attitude as much as it's anything, and it's served me well. All right. There we are. So yeah, this is what we just talked about. This is a fast forward of sort of the lowest level parts of rebuilding Rails. So, you're starting on rack. Most people haven't actually looked all the way down to rack. Most people haven't looked at what it looks like. It's very surprising how much of the power of something like Sinatra it gets by just using rack straight up without essentially anything else. And by the way, if you're inclined, you can get the code for this. I will pause a moment on this slide while you write down hangout-framework.get if you want to, but you can clone it right off GitHub. There's not a huge amount of code here, but all of the code in these slides is right here in this Git repository. All right, and anybody cloning can have done that. So a lot of you have seen this hello world for rack, but let's talk about what it does, because this is more than a little cryptic. The basic thing that your framework has to tell whoever's talking to it, so think about your browser, is the status. Is it success? Is it an error? That's that 200. It's got to say, turns out you've got to tell a browser content type text HTML. If you're hitting it with curl, it doesn't matter. You don't need the header. But if you want your browser to show it, you have to tell it what content type it is. And then you've got to have the output. And the output is just that hello world. And for somewhat confusing rack-related reasons, you've got to stick that into an array, except in the very latest version of rack. If you're using the very latest version of rack, you can leave off that last set of square brackets around hello world, and I'm going to completely ignore that for the rest of this talk and pretend we're using a slightly older version, because if any of you are, I want the code to work. So okay, that tells you what it is. It's still kind of a confusing, cryptic mess. So let's make it a little less confusing and a little less cryptic. Because that content type text HTML, I don't know about you, to me that stands out like a sore thumb. It's so specific, Here's this thing your browser needs. Status code 200, hello world, it's clear why you need those. Here's the thing your browser needs, and it's screwing up my code. But there's standard middleware that just takes care of that. So here's exactly what we had a couple of slides ago. And here's what it looks like if you add another rack layer, the rack content type. And so we can clear that up. To me, that 200 nothing hello world is a lot prettier. It says what you want to say, much more succinctly. And rack content type just means, I'm going to return something, you guess what it is. So great. That's cute. But it's still, I'll go back one, it's still a little cryptic. Open square brace, 200 braces, hello world in square braces. There's still some things to screw up there, and it's still a little ugly to my eye. So, this is Ruby. One of the easiest things in the world is just to pop it out into a method. So I'm making the output method where you pass in a string, and optionally you can pass in a status. So you get the status or 200. It automatically does, the hash table there. If you pass it a list, it will pass the list right through, and if you passed it a string, it'll put it into a list. So, turn it into what rack is looking for. And then, if you look down there at the bottom, your little run proc there is just output hello world, which is exactly what we want that to look like. To me, that is much, much prettier. You could also take that output, method and make it a library. That would be very, very easy to do. I'm not going to do it in this example, but it's Ruby. If you want to put it into a library and require it, obviously that's not rocket science. By the way, for those of you that are not familiar with rack, just to go back over that use again, the use rack content type and why that works. In Rack, you build your app out of a series of layers, each of which modifies the response. It can change what's coming in, it can change what's going out. So with Rack, it's very easy to restructure your app as, I'll just add this header on the way out, or I'll just change this parameter on the way in. We're not going to do a lot of that here, but in general, with Rack, if you start asking, why don't we, why don't we, make this layer more complicated, or what do we do if this layer becomes complicated? The right answer is almost always add a layer, just in case it seems weird to you to, that we didn't extract a method last time. This time we extract a method because the output part isn't really something we can do with layers because it's a pervasive change. It's a change in a whole bunch of places. So, Josh, how are we doing for questions, no questions?
Sorry, JP had me hidden so we could go full screen. No, we're actually doing pretty well right now, so.
Good. I like to ask because I can't tell if I'm way behind what everybody wants, way out ahead of what everybody wants. I don't know what people's Rack background is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Really appreciate checking in, but doing
okay. Excellent.
But again, real quick, just a quick reminder to everybody who's watching, please feel free to comment on YouTube, either on Twitter with hashtag RubyHangout, in IRC channel #RubyHangout, or in the Google Plus event, we'll find it. Thanks, guys.
Great. So, that's cute, but you sort of want your web server to respond differently depending on what path goes in. And the hello world is fine, but no matter what URL you put in, it just says hello world, which is pretty boring. So the general question is, well, how do we make the web server do something useful? So we'll start with the path. We'll start with what URL they put in. So I was defining that proc that just returns the hello world, and it turns out it takes an argument. So if you use the argument, you can see I've added env there up at the top. Then you can grab the path, that is to say, everything in the URL after the http:// and do whatever you want with it. This little %r thing is just declaring a regular expression, like you do with slashes, but given that we've got a slash in it, I think it's prettier to not use slashes as the delimiters. And so we just check path against that, and if so, then we say hello foo, because it starts with a /foo. Otherwise, we say, not found, status 400. And the nice thing about Ruby, really, is it's very easy to introspect into objects, to look at objects and see what they're doing. So this env thing is basically just a hash table. And if you're curious, what is all the information that I can use? What is everything that my server knows about the request? Just print out inv.inspect in here, and you can see a beautiful big block of information with everything in it. That's one of the early exercises in my book for the Rails thing, but it's true even for very simple frameworks. Yeah, and so that gets the path, and then we check for a leading /foo. I'll point out in passing that this doesn't check that foo is the last thing in the path. Like if you put /foobar all as one word, this will match that, because it really is just a straight-up regular expression match. There is nothing special to URLs or to routing going on here. We're just playing with strings. So, routing's fun, but what about views? I mean, we've all seen a variety of fun Rails herb views with the little less than % and % greater than. And those seem like they should be kind of a pain. And you can see down in the lower right here, here's an example of some of those herb views. The vast majority of you have seen them before. But herb comes in the Ruby 1.9 standard library. And the flavor of herb that Rails uses, a library called Arubis that implements the same thing with a slightly faster, more flexible library, is just a standard gem install. And it turns out it's got a pretty simple API, which is why, as the footnote says here, you can use herb for config files and all kinds of things. And in fact, people do. You can stick that same less than % into your database.yml, and it works fine. You can auto-generate almost any config file in quite a lot of Ruby libraries, Rails included. And by auto-generate, I mean you can put herb into it so that it's got the extra processing layer. So here's what that Arubis API that I just said was easy. Here's what it actually looks like. You need to require it. You need to get your template from somewhere. So when I say file.read myfile.text, I could put the string directly in this file. I could, do all kinds of things, but you need to get that string from somewhere. And you can see down below what myfile.text looks like with just the this is an herb template line. Then you create a new Arubis object, that eruby equals arubis eruby.new template. So create a new Arubis object with that template, and then say that.result. And the myvar arrow foo is just to declare variables. If I want myvar to be a variable defined in there, I have to tell it what that variable's value is. If you say eruby.result with no variables, great, you've got no variables defined, but it'll still very happily evaluate it. And puts I probably don't need to explain to anybody. So let's package that up into a method. Let's do that the way we would do it in our framework. So this just says from herb, and all it takes is a file name and whatever variables you want to use. And if you say no variables, great, you get the empty hash. And we do exactly the same thing. We read that file, we put it into the Arubis object, and then we just get the result as a string. So this is exactly the same code as before, just with the routing. And here is where it's using a real, actual, you can use herb in it view. Tiny little change, but it uses that same four-line method that we showed a couple of slides ago. And again, if you're following with the Git repository cloned off GitHub, you've got all of this in your code. Do make sure to remember to require Arubis. If it says something about Arubis, not defined, not found, remember to require Arubis. So here is an example of that template. If you stick that into template.html.herb, then point your browser at it, and you'll see, a template, and then pretty cool, 10 times. It's real views. I mean, it's the same basic thing that Rails does, and config.ru is still under 25 lines of code with everything, a fully contained config.ru. And again, if you want to check me on that, I think it's 23 lines in the Git repository, but you have that config.ru that does this. So that's cute. A lot of the sort of hand waving here is I've just shown you how quickly you can basically build Sinatra. Again, if we have spare time, I'm going to go through a second presentation where we literally write a 14-line Sinatra-style library where you could just say get, path, do, and it's a 14-line framework that implements it. If you're a clever sort and you know instance eval, then you can see how it could be 14 lines or even a lot less. But so, some more features, which you can write in under 10 lines each. Most of these are like 1 to 4 lines. Rack request query params. Turns out if you want a rack request, all you have to do is say rack request new, rackrequest.new, and pass in that environment variable, and it will cheerfully parse out your query params, it'll look at cookies, it will find your HTTP verb, it will do all of the same sorts of things that you're used to Sinatra doing for you, just immediately in a one-liner. And then from then on, you've got the params. Here we are. The Sinatra-style get routes. Again, that's something where I'll probably just show you exactly how to do that in that few lines. I think it's pretty awesome, but I'm biased. HTTP digest auth. So digest authentication, or you can also use basic authentication, but good God don't. That sends your password in plain text over the internet in the clear. Digest auth, which is not quite that bad. You saw that we used the rack content type middleware. If instead of that, or in addition to that, you want to set up an HTTP password with digest auth, it's the same thing. You set up the built-in HTTP rack middleware that just does that. You tell it what the password is to compare to, and it'll send a digest of that. That is one I believe we cover in Rebuilding Rails, and I know I posted about it on my blog. It's not terribly well documented. I mean, really none of this rack stuff is well documented. If I had to give you the one-line sales pitch for why, if you are building a framework, you need my book, that one-line sales pitch would go, rack documentation is horrible. Don't get me wrong, it's a great library. It does an amazing variety of really cool stuff, and you'll never know that to look at the documentation. You can also pop in analytics into your app in one line. your choice of a cute piece of middleware that will parse the HTML as you send it back and put in your Google Analytics snippet of JavaScript automatically, which I think is a cute hack. Or Rack-A-Mole, which is this beautiful, comprehensive thing that times all of your requests and looks for various kinds of problems and counts exceptions and puts it all into MongoDB. And Rack-A-Mole is a great example of how the Rack interface is complicated enough to do really interesting stuff. Rack-A-Mole is also, if you're interested in this kind of thing, really easy to copy and modify. There's a fork of Rack-A-Mole that I put together called HasterRack that takes this, and instead of putting it all into MongoDB, it puts it all into a Cassandra-backed metrics system that we built at Uyala. It's kind of a messy chunk of code, but one of the joys of Rack is it's sort of like Perl. No chunk of code in there is going to be big enough that you care too much how messy it is, at least if you do it right. With Rack middleware, the key is to keep it simple, simple, simple. And so Rack-A-Mole is kind of messy, but for one thing, you can clean it up. Yours doesn't have to be, but for the other, even if it's messy, it's a very nice, self-contained kind of mess. Or, again, you can just use it exactly like that. And from your point of view, in your app, you just say, use Rack-A-Mole, and it's taken care of. The information is collected, it goes into MongoDB, you pretty much don't have to care. And unit tests. If you folks haven't looked at RackTest, RackTest is a beautiful, tiny, incredibly valuable little library, and you just say in your unit tests, include RackTest, include the RackTest helper methods, and then here's how you make an app. And then in your tests, you just say, get / or post to /foo with these query params, and your unit tests are now instantiating a little fake Rack server basically with your Rack app and putting all of these things through. So if you want to make sure that you're not raising exceptions, if you want to make sure you're returning reasonable stuff, it includes both the helper methods to put the requests through and the various validation methods to make sure that you're redirecting when you should redirect and returning reasonable text. It doesn't directly parse your HTML, but the frameworks that use it, if you're going to use Rails testing, they will cheerfully parse your HTML in a variety of ways, or it's very easy to hook up an HTML parser. I mean, this is Ruby. There are how many different HTML parser libraries? Pick your favorite.
So now I have one quick question already, actually.
Please.
So
Please.
From Twitter, Ed Igmarin asks, what about Rack security? Any tips that they might use with Rails or Sinatra?
So Rails actually has surprisingly good default security. The blog posts I've made on this topic have managed to piss off everybody who's read it, as far as I can tell. So I don't know quite where to point you at, except the Rails security guide, which Ruby on Rails has the guides. Most of you who use Rails have stumbled across them. They're really good. But the Rails security guide is beautifully comprehensive about all of the problems that Rails solves and how it solves them, and a whole bunch of problems that Rails doesn't really solve and how you need to solve them. So as Rack security tips go, there's a lot of little one-off things I could tell you, but by far the best advice I can really give you if you care is to read through the Rails security guide and make sure for every problem there you've got a solution. Doesn't have to be the Rails solution. I mean, if you drop in Rails, you get a lot of solutions, but even if you want to use Sinatra, the problem with Sinatra is not that it's hard to secure. It's not hard to secure. The problem is all the stuff you don't know that you need to secure. Again, Rails can do a beautiful job of protecting you from yourself in a lot of these cases, and what I worry most about with Sinatra is how many people have no idea where they need to be protected from themselves.
I've definitely read blog posts by Yehuda Katz basically echoing everything you just said.
Yeah. Oh yeah, he's given some beautiful talks about when the framework should include particular security features. And Rails does a wonderful job balancing this. I mean, if you look at strong parameters, which are basically a solution to that GitHub security breach a while back, because even GitHub, which is a very sophisticated group of Rails programmers, great guys who clearly know what they're doing, the old way of doing it was not enough to save them, so what hope do you have? Strong parameters is very much, okay, seriously, nobody is using the blessed system where you have to opt in, now we're going opt out.
Yeah, and then Jordan actually here is bringing up some of the Rails security holes we've actually had recently. So I guess You're looking for like possible mitigations for them.
So for Rails, obviously, upgrade to the latest Ruby, upgrade to the latest Rails for this specific problem. But if you're curious in a more philosophical way, how would I avoid this kind of problem, which is an interesting one, do folks already know what the actual error was, what the big Rails security hole was? Here we go. I'll assume somebody doesn't, and I'll explain it. And you can zone out for 45 seconds if you already know it. YAML is a really versatile format. It's sort of like JSON or XML in what it allows you to serialize and deserialize, except that you are allowed to request completely arbitrary objects. You're allowed to say, here is the name of a class in Ruby. Make me one of those with these parameters. So you can see how somebody, even a little bit creative, can turn that into execute any code you want in a language like Ruby, where you can just pass a proc through. Make me an open struct with this proc. It's not surprising that there are giant gaping security holes if you're allowed to create any Ruby object in your memory space with any parameters you want.
Yeah. I think actually, Jordan, I don't think I quite got his question right, so I'm just going to let him ask
it. Sorry, please.
So the thing is, with all the recent security problems, the question is, does Rails really provide all of the proper security defaults we need? Quite a few of these we could have mitigated if we had the options to remove them, or if the security guide mentioned that we could, literally drop them from the core. Is there a way that Rails can improve that, or do people actually think that Rails does provide a 100%, bulletproof security?
Yeah. So Rails obviously does not provide 100% bulletproof security. Again, partly I'm going to defer to the Rails security guide, where they give a whole bunch of topics where they know they don't provide 100% security. The Rails security guide is full of things where they say, here's the problem, Rails doesn't solve it for you, here's what you need to do if you want to solve it. They're getting better about adding security for more and more of those problems, but they basically solved the easy ones. Like, I don't know if you guys remember in the Rails 2 to Rails 3 transition, one of the things they did was made it a lot harder to pass unescaped HTML through so that you could sneak JavaScript into various places. And that was something where doing it in a way that wasn't really intrusive, that wasn't a huge pain in your ass, is really hard. Like, they had to do a lot of interesting, weird technical work to make that work as well as it does in the way it does. Before that, if you remember, anytime you wanted that, and you pretty much always wanted it, you had to put the H in front. You had to tell it to escape the HTML. That's a great example of the kind of thing where it's not clear in advance that there is a solution. A lot of these problems, we're looking at them, and it's not clear in advance that there is a way your framework could solve that for you. Ruby is a frighteningly flexible language, and so frameworks can solve a lot of problems that in other languages probably couldn't. I mean, the technical underpinnings of that whole automatic HTML escaping thing, man, read through Yehuda Katz's post on that. It's amazing. I mean, it's amazing that it works. It's even more amazing that they found a way to do it that's reasonably fast 90% of the time.
And I think one of the biggest things about security is that you're never going to get everything. That's like the one fundamental about security is you're never actually 100% secure. I mean, I live pretty close where I live, right next to the NSA, and so a lot of my neighbors are like really into like cybersecurity and stuff like that. The main security is like, oh yeah, well, we can only get you close to secure,
Yeah.
So the Rails guys do a really great job of staying on top of things. I mean, they have a great security list, a great effort on security, but nobody's going to be perfect. So they're a lot better than any other web framework I've ever used. So I think that's good enough for me.
Yeah, that's what I'd echo. Is there's more than one way to evaluate them. If you say how close are they to 100%, nobody's ever close enough to 100%. How do they do compared to other open source web frameworks? They do really well compared to most open source web frameworks. And yeah, I mean, it's not forever, but seriously, look at Sinatra, look at Node.js, look at the frameworks where the whole point is let's have a simple framework where there's not too much magic going on behind the scenes. Well, that's great. I mean, there's a lot of cases where Node.js is the right tool or where Sinatra is the right tool, but nothing, as far as I'm concerned, comes anywhere close to Rails if you want to hack together a site quickly and then put it on the public-facing internet.
Yeah.
You need a huge amount of magic to protect yourself from yourself, unless you're already a yeah. Anyway,
Well, the question is, how quick is how good is the security of Quick? I mean, I understand that I could go and build a site in Rails in a matter of 5 minutes. I have before, actually. I built
yeah,
little blocks in about 5 minutes. But when
sure.
I go back and I review this code and I start penetrating, testing it, and all this, and I start asking myself, why is this happening when by default it should, deny it? And sometimes Rails enforces, the act, you have to get hacky to fix it. And that's where it all comes down to. Is I think Rails should give more options to users to remove these things like the XML parsing by default, and the old YAML
So
error that was going on.
here's the thing. Rails does give you options to remove that. It's just the same people who don't know about it and need to be saved from themselves don't know about those options. If you find a solution to that problem, man, tell me and tell Yehuda Cats. Um, I think this is probably the amount of security we want to talk about right now. I mean, it's a very good question. It's a great topic to raise. Thank you for raising it. It's also a hole with no bottom.
Yes. Thanks, Noah. We can keep going.
Cool. Yeah. So let me. I'll pop in. I'll do the last few slides here on the slideshow, assuming we don't have any more questions right this second. Here we go. We're most of the way through it. So yeah, HTTP auth or analytics. Again, rack middleware is the answer there. As a self-serving answer, I would say Chapter 8 of my book, and it's not a bad answer. Chapter 8 of my book is a pretty good introduction to rack middleware. We go through a lot of fun stuff. There's a lot of good blog posts out there. If you just Google for rack middleware, you'll find a lot of people who are trying to solve this problem. And you'll find both interesting ways to use the built-in rack middleware. There's some great built-in rack middleware. It's small, it's limited, but it does really useful stuff. And there's a lot of great third-party middleware. Like Rack-A-Mole is one of the best examples I know. It's one of the biggest, most complicated examples. But there's great third-party middleware out there to do neat things. So yeah, if you're going to build very many Ruby servers, the other nice thing about rack middleware is it works with Sinatra, it works with Rails, it works with that framework you just put together. It works with Ruby on Rulers, which is the sort of learning framework in my book. Rack middleware works with everything. And so that's another really powerful thing. Like, you should learn it because it'll work with everything. So let's hit one of the big questions, and the question we saw in the comments even before we started this talk. Why? Why plain rack? It's a good question. Very solid question. I've got a few answers to that. I'm sure other people have other answers, and for that matter, a lot of reasons why not. So no, I don't think it's a pure curiosity. I mean, I think that it's something that you can gain serious benefits by doing for yourself. I think it is practical to learn how to build servers on rack. One of the reasons I think it's practical to do that is speed testing and benchmarks. Every app server benchmark in Ruby that is worth anything is testing against a pure rack framework when it does it. And the reason for that is because your framework is slow. A Rails benchmark, where it tests Hello World in Rails, for any app server, you're pretty much testing the speed of Rails, because a Rails Hello World app is already slow enough that a slow app server still looks fast enough. Sinatra, it's better. It's closer. Sinatra's not as slow as Rails. But fundamentally, if you want to care about the amount of time you spend in your app server, you should be testing against a real little Hello World app. In Ruby, the Hello World app has to be the rack Hello World app. You want the one that just returns a straight-up string. So that first app that we saw, the config.ru with just the run proc, that is what you want to do all your app server benchmarking against. But more generally than that, to again, chapter 8 of my book there, one of the examples we do there is a little piece of rack middleware that profiles. And you can not only drop that in and see how fast your app is, you can drop it in at different places in the stack of rack middleware and find out how fast your app is, plus all the supporting stuff you're using. Rack is the right place to learn that, and writing this rack server is pretty much exactly the same thing as writing rack middleware. By the way, I don't have a monopoly on that benchmarking thing. You could certainly find existing third-party rack middleware to benchmark. I'm a big fan of the idea that you should write as much of your benchmarking framework code as possible, because there are lots of little invisible trade-offs there. There are lots of ways where it's easy to benchmark wrong, And until you actually learn how to write benchmarking code, which is not that hard, until you actually learn it, you're getting somebody else's version of those trade-offs. And your benchmark, I mean, you know your benchmark data is, wrong is too strong a word, but kind of misleading. But if you're a good benchmarker, you know exactly why and how it's misleading. And the way that you become a good benchmarker is to go do it yourself. Which is why I include something that builds, your own speed testing stuff in the chapter in my book. Not because I think that there's not good stuff out there. There's great stuff out there. There's wonderful benchmarking libraries out there, and they're all wrong in one way or another. You can prove Heisenberg style with a little work that any profiling library is going to be bad at some things. Benchmarking is exactly the same thing. It's going to be bad at some things. If you're a smart benchmarker, you know what your benchmarking method is bad at. Compatibility. I don't know how many of you still remember the very first slide there. I swore off using other people's frameworks when I met other people. Everything depends on Rack. If you're going to write a Ruby web server, the greatest compatibility level you can possibly get is I only trust Rack. Rack moves slowly, it moves carefully, it has good security fixes on a regular basis. If you were going to have maximum compatibility for your app or for your framework or whatever, Rack is by far the best thing you can depend on. Understanding and debugging your framework. Someday, even if you use Sinatra, you are going to hit a framework bug. You're going to do it. I've hit Sinatra bugs. I don't know how many of you have hit Sinatra bugs. I don't know how many of you have hit Sinatra bugs and never known it. And with Rails, all of that goes triple, quadruple, more than that. The more complicated your framework is, the more bugs it's going to have, just across the board. You are going to wind up, if you seriously care about this, debugging bugs in your framework. Again, I certainly have. And that all goes down to Rack. If you're debugging Sinatra, it all immediately looks like what we just went through. Sinatra is a very thin layer on Rack. Rails is a thick, kind of complicated layer on Rack. So, for debugging Rails, I wrote a book on the topic. I mean, there's a lot to say. I wrote a book on the topic, and you could write at least one more book the same length and not run out of things to say. And then building a new framework. Rails is awesome. Rails is a great framework. I have many good things to say about it. Wrote a book on the topic, yada, yada, yada. There's going to be a better one. I don't know what we're going to be using in 5 years, but I promise you there's going to be something better than Rails in 5 years. I don't think it's been written yet, but it will be. So if you're going to be the guy that writes that, you ought to learn how these frameworks work. Maybe it'll be in Ruby, maybe it won't, but you'd better learn how they work. And Rack is at such a level that it looks like CGI, it looks like WSGI, it looks like the other frameworks in every other language. And everybody watches Ruby. I mean, some of what we do is crazy. Some of the tool stuff that we come out with doesn't apply to other languages. Some of it is too weird. There's a reason we go through tools so fast. We have a lot of ideas, and some of them are good and some of them are bad. People have figured out that Ruby comes up with a lot of good ideas in with all the ideas and steal the ideas from this community quickly. That's not a bad thing. I'm not knocking anybody. I believe everybody should use many languages, and I believe that if you see something really awesome, steal it. But with that said, Ruby is going to be a very good language if you want to write the next awesome framework. You have a great idea for how that should work, a great idea for how to restructure it. You want to write something, like Lyft, where it does a beautiful on-demand evaluation thing all the way down the stack, all the way to the database level. Lyft is in Scala, by the way, which is a very good language for that specific thing. But it's a pain in the ass and people don't use it because it's in Scala. If you can find a way to do that in Ruby, you will have a much larger audience. And if you're going to do it in Ruby, if you're going to have a good framework that the right people steal from, you have to learn Rack. You have to know how Rack works. You can watch this on the Rails team, too. I don't know if anybody has read Tenderlove, Aaron Patterson's posts about server-side events for Rails 4.0, but where he's starting to hit interesting issues and problems, where he's starting to need to know more, is at the Rack level. You have to learn what your limits are if you're going to use the existing servers. And if you know Rack, then you're going to find out pretty quickly whether you need to write your own app server. By the way, if you can possibly avoid it, avoid it. But the way you know whether you can avoid it is you learn Rack. I see a little bit of chuckling, and yeah, I mean, it's the right thing to chuckle at, but it's also the more of other people's stuff you can leverage all the way up and down the stack, the faster you can make mistakes. If there's one most amazing lesson I got from the Ruby community, after doing C for 15 years and more before that. If there's one thing where I looked around the Ruby community and I said, you know what, you guys are doing it right, I'm doing it wrong, it's fail, fail, fail just as fast as you possibly can, and archive it everywhere. If you're a good programmer doing everything you should, not only will you be failing and pushing it all to GitHub the whole time, even and especially the stuff that sucks, that means that not only have you learned a huge amount and stored a great copy of all that for you, it means if somebody goes to my GitHub and looks at all that stuff I've failed at, and there's a bunch of it, there will keep being more, there's a bunch of it, you can get to go through all my mistakes in fast forward. You're welcome.
Awesome.
Yeah. And so, yeah, that is that presentation. We can go through the Sinatra one afterwards, but this is also a great stopping point for questions if anybody's...
Yeah, let's do that. So please, again, guys, questions via YouTube, Twitter, IRC, Google+. We will find them. Twitter, hashtag Ruby Hangout, IRC, Freenode.net, pound Ruby Hangout is the room. YouTube comments right as you're watching here, or G+ on the event. So I actually have a couple questions here real quick to kick things off.
Please.
So why even start with rack? Why not start with IO socket?
That's a really good question. If you have the time, definitely start with IO socket. I'm a firm believer in the idea that if I had time to write book after book after book, I'd write Rebuilding Rails, I'd write Rebuilding Rack, I'd write Rebuilding Unicorn probably. That would be my favorite example. That would be my favorite app server for an instructional book about how to rewrite it. Like, they've all got good and bad points, but if I was going to write an instructional rebuild your app server book, it'd be Unicorn. Then I'd keep going down below that, because Unicorn's fine, but you may want to hit the reverse proxy. Like, rebuilding Nginx would take me a while, and it wouldn't be high on my priority list, but it would be worth writing, if I could take the time to do that. I think everybody should write a good pull-based socket server at some point, just to know sort of what that history is, because you're using them whether you know or not. They're everywhere. Same thing with fork servers. Write one once. I don't think I'd get around to rebuilding Apache just because somebody else would be better to write that than I would. Thin and Apache can be somebody else's pet project instead of my pet project. I mean, they're worthy projects. It's just I'm not the guy to write them.
Rebuilding Linux.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, if you look at Linux, Linux was rebuilding Minix. I don't know how many of you know the history of that, but that's how Linux started out. And some of it was license issues, but some of it was, hey, let's build this thing. Let's figure out how it works. Yeah, Linux is that already, and yes, there's plenty of room to do it again.
Yeah, definitely. I can't speak highly enough of building something from the ground up that you are using all the time, and if you don't, even if you think you really understand it, you don't understand it. Not until you've actually built it yourself. I mean, like, cross-site scripting example, real quick thing that was just coming to the top of my head from the security talk. I used to write Java web apps with, struts 1.3. And there was no cross-site scripting, thing in that, so I had to write it all myself. And when I came to Rails, I was like, oh, this is done for me. Oh, this is amazing.
Yep. So. Yeah, Rails is beautiful that way. Even the ones I haven't had to build myself, I really appreciate some of these things because I have had to build it in other frameworks. Yes. I look at it and I say, oh, Rails protects me from this, and now I'm writing in Sinatra. Oh, shit.
So Sean has a question here. Are you going to the GitHub drink up tomorrow night?
I'm not going to make it there, no. See, no, I'm not going to make it there tomorrow night. I'm in Fremont. I live in Fremont. I'm working in Mountain View, and I have small children, so there's a lot of stuff I don't make it to just because,
Children, yeah.
Yeah. Until my littlest girl turns 3, I'm at home a lot.
How many and how old are they?
I have 2. I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old.
Nice. Very cool. Congrats.
Yeah, thank you. They're wonderful kids.
I think Chris is the only guy on the Hangout. Oh, JP. Chris and JP both have kids, so. Oh, Nathan has kids. I'm sorry. I always forget about your kids, Nathan. I noticed while you were going through the slides, you kind of did this building up kind of thing in the code. And is that in the GitHub repo via commits, or is it different files or something?
Yes, that's in the GitHub repo with commits. If you go through the history, you'll see that same build up.
Excellent. Cool.
Basically, I just go through the slideshow in the same order I went through it on my own machine.
Nice. Very cool. It was really great to see that come together. Um, let's see. Any other questions? I got a few more here. Can you do streaming I/O with Rack?
You can, but it's a huge pain. I mentioned Aaron Patterson's post about SSE and Rails. That's a good way to look at how to do it in Rails. The problem is that for SSE-style streaming, you need multiple connections, and so you wind up needing either a multi-threaded or a multi-process server, which, given some of Ruby's current limits, means that the development stuff is half-baked.
Gotcha. So we do the same thing for WebSockets.
Yeah. Now, the flip side of that is you can do streaming. You can do sort of Facebook-style slow response where you send out the header and then you slowly sort of feed out the page a little at a time, and you leave the connection open as though you were just a really slow server. And that can work. There are all kinds of fun problems with that, but don't take that to mean there aren't fun problems with the other approach. Both approaches have horrible problems, really.
So if I wanted to re-implement Shoutcast with Rack, I probably could.
With work, and it would be very specific to which app server you used. Thin is very amenable to, I'll just leave this thread open running in the background. Unicorn is not amenable to any of these approaches. I mean, it's better at polling than anything else, but fundamentally Unicorn is designed for fast responses, and so you'll wind up running multiple processes in dev, which can cause all kinds of fun problems.
Yeah, you just need rainbows.
Say again?
You just need rainbows then.
Rainbows actually, yeah, is a lot like Thin that way. It's good with the threading. Yeah, but basically you wind up with usually an event machine approach, again with either Thin or Rainbows. Goliath is the same thing, but again event machine. Like all of this stuff winds up evented. I don't want to bias anybody one way or another as far as the event libraries. Don't treat me as a worldwide authority on it or anything. But I'll say that Event Machine is not my very favorite.
Is it because of the API, or is it just something else?
It's not that it's young, it's that it's a fairly ugly solution to the problem, and I can't tell how much of that is evented in Ruby and how much of that is bad design choices. I don't know. I would have to use it a lot more to have a strong opinion there. Somebody asked me about Celluloid. Celluloid is definitely a better interface. Celluloid definitely fixes some real just design issues in the event machine interface. With that said, it's tough to make Celluloid work well with C-Ruby, with Matz's Ruby. It's a lot happier on Rubinius or JRuby, which is fine and thoroughly reasonable. And the problem with things like Rubinius and JRuby is that they get good threading and good performance, but they have terrible startup time. All of these are bargains with a lot of trade-offs. And
by terrible, you're talking about like half a second, not like 20 minutes.
Yeah, more like half a second. The problem is that if JRuby, you're talking maybe up to 4 seconds in a lot of cases. Yeah, somebody says he said JRuby take upwards of a minute. Yeah, that's thoroughly conceivable, especially with something like Rails where you're doing a lot of loading and you're doing a lot of startup time. A minute for JRuby is long, but it's thoroughly credible. That could absolutely happen. Somebody asks, if you were going to have a long connection, what library would you wind up using? If it were me, and I had a long connection, I would wind up grabbing the old Juggernaut server. I don't know if anybody remembers Juggernaut. Not Juggernaut 1.x, but Juggernaut 2, which the author has claimed is now entirely obsoleted by server-side events. And having used server-side events in Rails, my opinion is now definitely that he's wrong.
Is that the one that connected to the Flash front end?
Juggernaut had a Flash front end, yeah, and it used Redis on the back end. So it's basically Redis pub sub, where your Rails app sends server-side commands to Redis, and then Redis through an XML Flash socket or WebSockets or a couple of other things can send back down to your JavaScript. And so you can broadcast to one or more web browser clients from your Rails app. The thing is that because it's just Redis PubSub, you can also just hook anything that speaks Redis up to it. And so if you want persistent state that isn't tied to your website, great. You listen for events on one side and you broadcast them on the other, and now you've got a little persistent server that just talks directly to the browsers. You can't talk to the Rails app because Rails requests are designed to be quick and transient. The idea is HTTP request comes in, response goes out. It's not running at the moment. But that's all right, because if you have anything that wants to sit and be long-running and field requests, you make it a little persistent server like that. I've made a couple of different attempts to make a little Rails game framework on exactly that principle, where your game is a little persistent server that talks to Redis PubSub. And most recently, I've been trying to do that with Rails 4. If you look at ACS, which is a recent GitHub project of mine, don't recommend it in production, not at all. It's experimental. But it's an attempt to do the same thing with Rails SSE, and that's a lot of the reason I'm saying that Rails SSE is not baked yet, not ready for prime time. They've made the interesting choice that they are only willing to multi-thread if you precompile all classes in advance and cache all classes, which means the development style just Rails reload by definition is incompatible with the Rails multi-threading. You cannot get development mode and multiple threads, and you need multiple threads for SSE. So there is no development mode for a persistent server framework like that.
That's too bad.
Is there any outlook on them trying to fix that issue?
Well, so in Rails 4, they made the API substantially worse, which will make it harder to fix. I have no idea when they'll fix it. I have no idea when they'll even notice. That's all right. Rails 4 has a bunch of stuff that I think will cause public outcry, and so I'll try to add my voice to the public outcry on that, but, amid the pitchforks and burning torches on Turbo Links, I don't know if anybody will notice.
I cried over Turbo Links for a couple days.
Yeah, you're not alone, man. Yeah, many people feel exactly that way about Turbo Links. I'm guessing probably the jQuery maintainers, too.
So the one thing that I like about Rails 4, though, is that they're finally moving to a more modular format. I don't know if that's even right terminology. But what I mean is they're finally throwing out stuff that a lot of people don't use and putting it into gems that are optional. And that really surprised me, and I was really happy about that. That's probably the best thing I like about Rails 4.
Yeah, that's been a gradual process. Rails 3 was a lot of that, too. I agree, it's a really awesome thing. Like Rails 3 beats the hell out of Rails 2 for... if you're writing plugins, if you are, sort of reaching down deep into the internals of it. And yeah, Rails 4 continues that process. But I would argue that Rails 3 was the really big victory there. But you're right, they keep doing it. And yay, awesome. I'm glad they keep doing it. The other thing they're doing is they finally renamed the unit tests and functional tests and the model tests, but they're calling them model tests, controller tests. I think view tests are in there too. So they're finally in step vocabulary-wise with the rest of the world.
Nice.
How do you feel about the HStore output? I mean, for me, it was, we finally got HStore in Rails 4, but at the same time, it's like, oh no, I'm finally shifting over to Postgres JSON, and in 9.3 or whichever one comes next, I'm going to shift over to JSON entirely. So I'm still a legacy.
You may have hit something about Rails 4 I haven't noticed. HStore? I don't.
Rails 4 finally got Postgres HStore support. The inline hashes for Postgres.
Okay, I haven't looked at that at all.
The majority of us, we've been using HStore for a couple of years now since it first came out. I think it was like 9.1 that we first got it. And now with 9.2, we finally have JSON, and a lot of us are shifting over to JSON. So to me, I still feel like, with Rails, I'm still working with legacy systems. I wish they would have, thought about JSON too. But I don't know if they are or haven't. I haven't heard any word on it.
Yeah, I don't know. Honestly, when I'm trying to find out about Rails 4, the first place I go is the actual commits. I mean, if you Google, you can find you can find on GitHub the various commits and the debate on there, and very often the only place you're going to find that is debate on the commits or in the pivotal tracker. it's interesting. You can often find like closed bugs that have been closed as won't fix. You can find really interesting issues that they brought up and talked about and decided not to go with. One of my favorite is database.yml is pretty much the only YAML thing left in Rails. Like they've converted away from YAML for all kinds of things. And you could really trivially write a little Ruby DSL that would be easier to use. And that's how they do basically all of their other configuration, just everywhere. Generating the equivalent of database.yml. I mean, you wouldn't even have to make a new Ruby DSL. Really, you could just like hook it up to Active Record, which has most of that already. Write a couple of helpers and you're done. DHH, David Heinemeier Hansen, was in favor of getting rid of it, in fact, and he was voted down by the other members of the Rails core team on that. Like, you can find the bug if you go Google. It's one of those things where I went, oh, hey, that's a neat idea. I could get rid of database.yml and replace it with a Ruby DSL. Oh, wait, they thought of that and voted it down. Okay, so this is not a patch that Rails is going to accept anytime soon.
Very surprising.
They've done that with that bin stubs thing. I really wish that got downvoted.
Yeah, a lot of the bundler stuff is just weird. I love the bundler. I think it's a wonderful tool. It's definitely not something I think you're going to see stolen widely by other languages anytime soon, because I don't know if you've read Yehuda Katz's excellent posts about how he designed it and why he did various things, and just lots and lots about the bundler. He did a great job documenting those decisions, but they're weird decisions. You have to read his articles if you want to understand why it does what it does, and he's right. I mean, if you read those, he's not wrong about the design stuff. It's just there are tools that come out with an intuitive design where once you see sort of the one interesting bit, you get the trick. Then from there on, it makes sense. Bundler is not one of those tools. Bundler is weird in all kinds of ways, all the way down.
That's how I feel about Ember sometimes, too.
I haven't used Ember. I mean, I could believe it, but I haven't used it.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier that you hit some bugs in Sinatra. I was just kind of curious what those bugs might have been.
We've had a couple of fun problems with parsing query params, where we wanted to embed like an ampersand in the value of the query param using, escaped. You do it with HTML escapes. But for a while, Sinatra was removing the escapes and then calling split. So if you had an ampersand in there, it would effectively split it out into another query param, which is not rocket science, and certainly not the end of the world, and it's entirely understandable how that could sneak through. And it turns out that if you know rack, you just go down to the rack request level and you reparse it yourself, and then you don't have that problem. If you know rack, if building little framework things like that in rack is second nature to you, which it wasn't for the guys I was talking to at the time. But just because I know how to do it doesn't mean my solution always wins the vote.
Yeah. For sure. Well, if we don't have any more questions right now, I think we actually have a little more time if you wanted to go through your other...
Sure. Sure. So let me pop open... There we go. I'll hit screen share. So I gave this as a lightning talk at the Hacker Dojo, and all 3 people who showed up loved it. So I hope you guys will too. Do you guys know the Hacker Dojo? You have anything like? You've got to have something like that. A little co-working space for hackers. It's awesome.
Oh yeah, a bunch of co-working spaces around here.
Yeah, if you're headed out to the Bay, Hacker Dojo is worth your time. They're awesome.
Nice.
Okay, so rack plus 5 minutes equals Sinatra. Your mileage may vary, but really this is about a 5-minute level of rack framework. So if you're going to do a rack framework. You can make a couple of empty directories, one for the app, one for the framework. It's not really a framework unless it's in a separate gem. You can put together the gem files, source Ruby gems, gem spec for the framework, source Ruby gems, and tell it where the framework is for the app. And it's just saying, my framework, .. my framework. Because if you make them both from the same directory, great, it's right there. And hey, look, here's a minimal gem spec. So your myframework.gemspec, here's what you actually needed to put in to get it to run at all. And it depends on rack, which is the only interesting bit. So now, here's the actual interesting part. We'll do in config.ru, include your app library, run app.new, exactly like config.ru for a Sinatra app, except you're including your app file. And app.rb, require your framework. And then the other things, the get slash and the get slash name, should look a lot like Sinatra to you. In fact, if you change require my framework to require Sinatra, it will run just fine in Sinatra. So this is the app that we are going to write a tiny little framework to implement. So we've moved through that pretty quickly, but without further ado, here is that framework. So let's talk about what there is in it. You'll notice that it keeps a hash table of routes up there. Routes equals empty hash. And then get, all it really does is you pass get a route and a block, and it puts it right into that hash table. So every time you call get, save that block off and say what path it belongs to. And then class app, def call, get the environment. So it grabs the path, and it just looks it up in the hash table. Routes, blah, to get the route proc. And then we get to the interesting bit. The 200, of course, is not the interesting bit. The content type text HTML, of course, is not the interesting bit. Make a new rack request out of that environment, which, by the way, is going to parse out all your cookies, it's going to parse out all your params, it's going to give you all the interesting information about that request. .instance eval route proc, where route proc is that block you gave me back when you defined the get. So rack request has a bunch of interesting stuff like params defined as instance methods on it. Instance eval means that your block can just say params, and it will get the rack request params. So going back a sec to that, that's actually why the params u block works here, is because it's executing inside a rack request. And of course, if you just return a string like hello world, hey, that works. So you can see how not only do I do this in 14 lines in a large font size on a slide, but there's a guy who claims he's doing it in 6 lines. And yeah, you can see how you could collapse this down to about 6 lines and still have it work. And as it says there, you now have a little 14-line custom micro framework you can put into any of your random open source projects. How awesome does that make you? That's something you'll hear again and again in rebuilding Rails as well. You know, here's a fun trick, here's a fun trick, here's a fun trick. Now how awesome does it make you?
Does it have pictures of cats kicking dogs?
It does not. Rebuilding Rails is short on many things, and while my slideshows do tend to have webcomics and cat pictures and all of the good stuff you'd hope for, Rebuilding Rails is sadly very short on that. But you know what? If you email me and you say that you expected more cat pictures in Rebuilding Rails and that you are deeply disappointed in me, I promise to send you cat pictures by email in response to that so that you don't wind up with too few.
We can all use more cats.
It's a service I'm happy to provide the community.
So why does rack request exist? Is it only for instance eval APIs?
No, actually, usually if you want to implement, say, Sinatra params, what you do is you take that end, you parse it into a rack request, you save the rack request, and then you just return that request.params to get params. Instance eval is just a very cute way to say, I'm not going to provide essentially anything beyond what rack provides, so just evaluate in the context of that request. It's a hack. It's a way of forwarding every method that you call to the rack request. When in fact with Sinatra you would just forward some of them to the rack request. There's a lot of these where I assume his 6-line one also has some cute hacks. There are a lot of ways to do a cute thing like evaluate it all in the context of the rack request to avoid building much more interesting code. I think of it as sort of conceptual code golfing. You guys know code golfing?
Yeah.
So golf, the whole point is to cut strokes off your golf game.
Golf. Sorry, I misheard you.
Yeah. You know, you're trying to do it in as few strokes as possible. Code golfing is cutting keystrokes down. The idea is fewest lines or fewest characters. But I would say much more valuable than the various fun, I can't read it, it's all line noise, code golfing exercises. Yeah, code golfing is hard. Is what I think of as concept golfing. How simple, conceptually, can you make your framework and still make it 80% as useful as the real thing? And if you want to see a giant example of concept golfing, allow me to, again, recommend Rebuilding Rails, because figuring out how to make something like Rails in the amount of code that I can actually print page after page after page in a single book without making your eyes bleed is all about the concept golfing. How simple can I make this and still have it basically work the same way?
So you've just differentiated yourself from all the Perl hackers.
Well, I'm glad there's a way to do that. Anyway, so once you've got that, you guys are rack experts after that last presentation. So you probably already knew you can just bundle exec rack up to run your app there, and it works. You know, you can hit curl and it'll say hello world. You can point your browser to it, it'll do that. You can pass in parameters using curl or your browser, and as it says, if you go to /name $u equals Bob, it'll say, hey Bob. And yep, in the browser. So, you can see how I managed to give that in about 3 minutes as a lightning talk at Hacker Dojo. But the thing is that once you've had this introduction to rack, there's not really any magic there, right? I mean, instance eval is cute, and it's a little bit magical. But of that, I'll build Sinatra in 14 lines. Almost none of that should surprise you. Instance eval is the only thing where it's a real, oh, hey, that's a cute trick. And honestly, you could find a way to do that without instance eval. It wouldn't take you a lot more lines. That's really the lesson from the rack presentation, is now that you know how to do that, it's just coding. Like, it's not any more magic than Ruby coding always is.
Cool. But Ruby coding is pretty magic.
It is. It is. Next time you do it, I didn't manage to work this into my 14-line Sinatra, but do you know the horrible trick where you can take a string and dereference with another string or with a regular expression instead of a number? Have you seen this?
No.
Let me pop up an iTerm window.
Yeah.
And I'll show you that at IRB. It's a horrible, horrible trick. I am not condoning it exactly. Somebody's seen it. I see it. Oh Lord, in the comments. Somebody's seen this trick. Okay.
Live coding, beware.
Here we go. I think I think you guys should be able to see my.
You blow it up a little bit.
That's a really good idea. Here, let me.
Well, there you go. That works. You can just make the window shorter.
Yeah, some of each. Some of each. Okay, is that pretty visible? Can you see the letters?
Perfect.
All right. So if I'd start with the string Bob and I dereference by a substring, it'll do that. But if the substring's not in there, it'll be nil. So that returns true or false depending on whether that substring is in there. But it looks for anywhere in it. It's not a prefix. It's anywhere in there. So that's cute. I mean, that's certainly not the most horrible little Ruby trick of that kind I could be showing you. I think dereferencing an integer by an integer is probably the most horrible trick of that kind, but I'm biased. Yeah, oh, if you haven't here, I think it is evil. Anybody know what it's doing?
Is it? No. Oh, yeah, it's a mod, isn't it? No. No.
Somebody says, magic? Yes. No, what it's doing is it's treating the integer like an array of bits, and it's returning bit 0, bit 1, bit 2, bit 3.
Of course.
If you ever use that in production, I pray it's an accident. You're right, Sean. Yes, magic. Okay.
It's my awesome bit array for checking flags.
Yeah, so I mentioned that. It turns out you can also dereference by a regexp, and it'll return it. And so you can determine for a string or a regexp. Yeah, you can determine for a string or a regexp which one works, which means in your horrible 14-line Sinatra framework, instead of looking it up in the hash table, what you can do is you can take your hash table.keys and you can keep comparing it that way, one after another, until one works. And when you do that, that means that instead of just saying, you know, get/foo, you can also say get/foo. You can have strings and regexps and mix them and just keep looking until one works.
Nice.
The string match, you know.
Yeah.
Whether the route path was a string or a regexp, you can just check it directly that way and see if it matches.
Oh, that is...
Go ahead.
That is evil. That is the most evil Sinatra hack ever.
Yeah. So you can probably get the line count down below 14 and make it accept regular expressions at the same time. Especially if you're a fan of doing, what's that great phrase, the full Lisp chainsaw? Have you heard the phrase, the full Lisp chainsaw?
Uh-uh.
So, you know how Lisp has the full set of map and reduce and, find the first one that matches and all of these functions that take functions as arguments? The Python guys apparently refer to as the full Lisp chainsaw. And so if you're a Python guy, you look at it and you say Ruby has the full Lisp chainsaw. We have map and we have reduce and we have, first and we have select and we have, the cute like grep thing. And okay, it's cute if you're me. It's probably pretty horrible if you're not used to it.
Those Python guys just wish they had all the full chainsaw.
Well, I mean, they could, right? They're halfway there. It's just that Guido says no.
Yeah. Yeah. He's too scared
so
to
you
know
could
a bunch
say,
of programming languages.
But yeah, so it turns out that if instead of doing the routes blah, this will give you, I mean, 1.9 does it even in insertion order, so this will give you the same ordering constraint that Sinatra uses, first to last in the file. And it's a one-liner to find the first route that matches whether it's a string or a regex. It's horrible, of course. So when you're doing this thing that you should never, never do, this is how you would do it.
I am going to use that in the future. Chris is right.
I've used Duff's device in real production C code, and so I'm not in a position to be holier than anybody on this.
Absolutely.
I'm a dinosaur. Probably nobody here knows what Duff's device is. Google it. It's horrible.
There's no such thing as horrible in Ruby. Just look at other people's code.
Sorry, say again, Jordan?
There's no such thing as horrible in Ruby. Just look at everybody's code.
Well, my favorite point of view of that comes from Reg Braithwaite. If you don't read him, he's amazing, and if you don't read him, I understand. He's dense. His writing is whoa. But he's a big fan of the idea that Ruby is a really sharp tool that most people shouldn't use. And at the same time, if you don't give really good, sharp tools to your very best people, there's a whole bunch of awesome stuff that just never happens. Ruby is a great place to try a whole bunch of stuff out, and some small amount of that's going to turn out to be a good idea. And so we'll keep using that, and other languages will steal that, and then the rest of it maybe, we can all sort of pretend didn't happen eventually.
That's those times when you're looking at a new library and you're like, man, this guy really should have rethought this.
Yeah. Well, and my favorite are still the ones where you look at it and you say, someday, somebody's going to take this and make a really awesome tool. This is not that tool. I say that about Git. I love Git. I'm the Git guy at this company. I was a Git guy at the last company. I was, becoming the Git guy at the company before that. Someday Git is going to be the plumbing behind a really awesome source control system.
I think they're actually trying to do that themselves. I mean, here recently they've added so much stuff that I feel we've been asking for a long time, like the ability to sign commits and some of the other lower level things with working with head and stuff like that. I was like, finally 10 years after we asked for it.
So I've got to say, I have never seen anybody add anything to Git that prevents you from having to know all of the full ugly complexity when you start debugging. As soon as you get yourself into a lousy situation, you really, truly have to know Git basically all the way down to the ground with everything I've ever seen. Gitflow is a fine idea. Gitflow does some neat stuff. Gitflow is a good way to get people who don't know Git really well not to hurt themselves too badly too often. And in practice, the way I've always seen that work out is you can put training wheels on some of it, and as soon as the people fall off their training wheels, what you train them to do is to say, Noah!
That's what I saw about Git is, like the other day I had accidentally deleted something out of my Git, and some guy was like, and then I added something accidentally too, and some guy was like, well, you need to hard reset. And I was like, man, that might be the silliest thing I've ever heard somebody recommend about Git. You should never hard reset, because you know how much of a pain it is to go and search through your catch and try and recover a file you accidentally deleted it. I mean,
well, actually, with the ref log, it's pretty easy, and yet nobody seems to know about the ref log.
See, I had to go all well. Actually, that's what I did had to do was get the ref log and then get the shot, and then I had to pull it from the catch. But still, I
Yep.
mean, it's still a pain to to do all that, and a lot of people, like you said, don't know about it. It's one
Yeah.
of
Ref,
the tools.
yeah. If you know what you're doing, reflog and cherry pick will solve just about any problem you're in. If you don't know what you're doing, reflog and cherry pick will get you into a level of problem you can't possibly get out of. So, I try not to train people in that first,
I
but
think Get AM is one of those oddities people don't know about too, even though it's a fundamental thing that people should know about.
I'm sorry, which is? Say again?
Get AM, the patching, like
AM.
if somebody sends you a patch file, Get AM is how you would insert that patch file.
Oh,
I
right.
didn't know about
Yep.
that up until like maybe 3, 4 months ago, and I was like, how did I not know about this magic? And I had gone through the whole Get SCM book and everything, and it had never mentioned anything about, if somebody sends you a dirty pull request on GitHub, how you would pull it down and put it in yourself, or cherry pick specific pieces. I had to
Yeah.
ask Conrad how to do all that, and I was like, this is like a fundamental thing they should be talking about.
They should, and I mean, the tools are there. If you look at Git, it's really clear that Git was built for the Linux kernel because the problems that you see on the Linux kernel, Git has really good solutions for, and that's a canonical, like that's how the kernel works, is people emailing patches around. So Git has great tools for that, and the problem is people try to document it like it's SVN, which would be a terrible tool to work on the Linux kernel for. So yeah, there's a lot of very specialized tools out there where Git has beautiful, well-honed answers, from back before most stuff ever worked decently. But it's so poorly documented. So poorly documented. So maybe rebuilding Git one of these days, but man, I don't know. I have enough books I could sit and write them forever, but there's always so much to do.
Yeah, yeah. So I think on that note, we're actually going to move over to our social time.
Great.
So thanks again very much, Noah, for joining us. Really appreciate it. Learned a lot about Rack for sure. I'm not sure I'm going to go write my own Rack server right now, but definitely going to keep all that right in my head. Uh, definitely, Sean says my brain is full. I totally agree.
Well, yeah, a lot of it is just when you get a chance, sit down and work through the code. There's only like 25 lines of code there, but once you've actually sat down and poked at it, and preferably made a mistake or two along the way, you'll get it way more than trying to just absorb the whole thing, from scratch. It's like so many other things. IRB is your tool. Go to IRB, and it'll always steer you right.
Absolutely.
Cool.
So at this point, we're going to actually move over to our social time, drink up, meet up stuff. So how we do this is I have a public Google spreadsheet. It is at a URL that I will share with you guys on Twitter, and I'm going to put it in IRC and stuff. If you don't see it, it is bit.ly/ capital Y, little b, capital U, little s, 20. Yeah, that's not going to work. Just look on Twitter. Go to Twitter, look for the Ruby Hangout. That's where it's going to be. Come and join us. If you start a public Hangout, just click on Start Hangout, invite public, and then anybody can join, and then you copy the URL from the URL bar and put it in the spreadsheet, and then people can click on the URL and join. I'm going to start one. I ask that some of our moderators here start one each, so we should have a 2 or 3 of them going. And please feel free to join and chat, and we can drink some beer, talk some geek out, talk Ruby, talk Rack, and have a good time. So thanks once again, Noah. Thanks again to our moderators, Chris, Jordan, Nathan, and Sean. And thanks once again, JP, my co-organizer. Again, I'm Josh Schmeida, at jschmeida on Twitter. And looking forward to seeing you guys next time. We're going to have, actually know who we're talking to next time. Aaron Kalin is going to be talking about software licensing on April 3rd at 7 p.m. Eastern again, 4 p.m. Pacific, everything else figured out. Thanks, guys. Have a good one. Thanks, Noah.
You too.